In the sleepy town of Pine Grove, 3 outlaws made a fatal error threatening the wrong barber. They couldn't have known that the quiet man carefully trimming hair had more confirmed kills than all of Delta Force's top snipers combined, or that their threats would force a legendary marksman known as the Ghost to emerge from retirement after devastating losses in Fallujah. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun filtered through the freshly cleaned windows of Miller's Barbershop, casting long shadows across the meticulously swept hardwood floor. Inside, James Miller worked with practiced precision, his scissors moving in smooth, calculated strokes as he trimmed Mr. Henderson's grey hair. Every movement was deliberate, efficient, a trait that had served him well in another life, one he'd spent years trying to forget. The gentle snip of scissors and occasional hum of the vintage ceiling fan created a peaceful rhythm that had become the soundtrack to his new existence. 5 years he'd been cutting hair in Pine Grove, and in all that time, Sarah Thompson at the diner across the street had never seen him waste a single motion or speak an unnecessary word. "James, have you ever thought about hiring some help?" Sarah asked, leaning against the doorframe of his shop, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "You're booked solid 3 weeks out now." The question earned her the slight upturn of his mouth that passed for a smile these days. "What would I do with all that extra time, Miss Sarah?" His voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind that made people lean in closer to hear. It was also the kind of voice that made them underestimate him, which suited James just fine. The barbershop was quiet this afternoon. Just old Pete McCarthy reading his newspaper in the waiting area and Dr. Wilson making notes in his medical journal by the window. The doctor glanced up occasionally, his eyes meeting James in that knowing way they had. Of all the people in Pine Grove, only Dr. Wilson knew why James' hands, now so careful with scissors and razors, had once been legendary in the shadowy world of special operations. The peaceful routine was interrupted by the hurried entrance of Deputy Marshal, his young face creased with concern. "Afternoon, Sarah, James." He nodded to them both, then lowered his voice. "Got word from Cedar Creek. The Hawkins brothers have been spotted heading this way." James's hands didn't pause in their precise trimming, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow so brief anyone else might have missed it. Sarah didn't miss much, though. She'd been watching over this street long enough to read people better than most. "The Hawkins brothers?" she asked, her voice dropping. "Thought they stayed up north near the state line." "Times change," Deputy Marshal sighed, accepting the coffee Sarah offered. "They hit 3 banks in the last month. Latest word says they're moving south, probably looking for easier targets, now that the state police have beefed up patrols up north." Dr. Wilson had set aside his journal, listening intently. "How many in their crew now, Jack?" "5 that we know of," the deputy replied. "The 3 brothers, Marcus, Tyler, and Ray, plus those 2 ex-cons they broke out of Sterling prison. Mean bunch. They don't just rob anymore. They like to make examples of people who resist." James's hands finally stilled on his scissors, his fingers unconsciously touching a small scar behind his right ear, a habit none of them had ever mentioned, but all had noticed. "Pine Grove's got nothing worth their trouble," Sarah said firmly, as if speaking it would make it true. "They'll pass us by." "Maybe," Marshall agreed, but his eyes drifted to James, still meticulously trimming Mr. Henderson's hair. "Still, might be wise to send word to the state police, get some extra deputies out here just in case." "Takes 2 days for help to arrive from the state police," James spoke softly, resuming his work. "If they're coming, they'll be here sooner than that." The deputy studied him for a long moment. "You seem mighty sure about that." "Just arithmetic, deputy," James replied quietly. "Nothing more." But his words carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Mr. Henderson chose that moment to examine his freshly trimmed hair in the mirror. "Perfect as always, James. You've got steadier hands than any barber I've ever known." James nodded in acknowledgement, carefully brushing stray hairs from the man's shoulders. Everyone in the room knew those steady hands hadn't come from barber school. It was just one of those little fictions they all maintained, like pretending not to notice how he always kept his right side facing the door, or how his eyes constantly scanned reflections in the mirrors, even when the shop was empty. As the afternoon deepened toward evening, shadows lengthened across the barbershop's polished floor. James methodically cleaned his tools, arranging them with military precision in their leather case. Straight razors gleaming under the warm lights, scissors aligned perfectly, each implement in its designated place. The routine was comforting, familiar, like field stripping a weapon in another life. Through the large front window, he watched Pine Grove settle into its evening rhythm. The hardware store across the street was closing up, Old Man Thompson triple-checking the locks as he did every night. The diner's neon sign flickered to life, casting a warm glow on the sidewalk where Mrs. Chen's youngest daughter practiced her violin, the sweet notes drifting through the cooling air. Dr. Wilson remained in his usual chair, though he'd long since stopped pretending to read his medical journal. "Those supplies I ordered for your migraines came in on yesterday's train," he said casually, though everyone in the room knew James hadn't suffered a headache in all the years they'd known him. It was another of their carefully maintained fictions, like the way the doctor's medical bag always seemed heavier when he visited the barbershop, heavy with things that had nothing to do with medicine. Sarah had returned to the diner, but she kept glancing across the street, her worry visible even at a distance. James caught her eye in one of the mirrors and gave a slight nod of reassurance. 5 years she'd been looking out for him, ever since he'd arrived in Pine Grove with nothing but a duffel bag and haunted eyes, looking for a place to disappear. The bell above the door chimed as Sheriff Parker entered, his weathered face grave. "Evening, James. Doc." He nodded to them both, then moved to the counter where James was arranging his tools. "Got more news about the Hawkins crew. They shot up a police station in Cedar Creek, 3 deputies dead." James's hands didn't pause in their methodical work, but his reflection in the mirror changed subtly. A shift in posture so slight only those who knew what to look for would notice. "How far?" he asked, his voice maintaining its quiet calm. 2 hours, maybe less," Parker replied, watching James's reflection. "They're not even trying to hide anymore. Marcus Hawkins, he's got a point to prove now. Word is he's looking to make a name for himself, show everyone he's worse than his daddy ever was." The mention of the Hawkins patriarch hung heavy in the air. Old Man Hawkins had terrorized 3 states before a special operations team had taken him down 5 years ago. The official report said it was a joint FBI military operation, but rumors spoke of a single shooter, a ghost in the night, who'd made an impossible shot at 800 yards in a thunderstorm. "Might want to close up early," Parker suggested, his hand unconsciously touching his service weapon. "Give folks time to get home, lock their doors." James carefully aligned the last razor in its case. "Shop stays open," he said quietly, "just like any other night." Parker and Dr. Wilson exchanged glances. "James," the sheriff started, but James cut him off with a subtle shake of his head. "Some folks need to understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that the quietest predators are the most dangerous." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He'd been one of the few who'd checked James's background when he'd first arrived, who'd seen the heavily redacted military files, the missing years, the commendations that said everything by saying nothing at all. As if to punctuate the moment, Mrs. Chen's violin practice faltered, then stopped, the silence more noticeable than the music had been. Through the window, they watched her mother usher her inside, the street emptying as word spread about the approaching danger. 5 years is a long time, Parker said carefully, watching James clean his mirrors with the same precision he'd once used to clean rifles, long enough for skills to get rusty. Some skills, James replied softly, you never forget, like riding a bicycle or calculating windage at 1,000 yards. Dr. Wilson closed his journal with a decisive snap. Well, I should get back to my office. Need to check on Mrs. Peterson's new baby. He stood, gathering his unusually heavy medical bag. James, don't forget those migraine supplies. Special order, wrapped in green cloth. James nodded, though everyone in the room knew the only thing wrapped in green cloth in his shop was stored in a locked case beneath the floorboards. A precision tool from another life, one that could reach out and touch targets at distances that seemed impossible to ordinary men. The sun had nearly set now, painting the sky in shades of blood red. James continued his evening routine, each movement measured and precise, but his stance had shifted imperceptibly. To most, he still looked like nothing more than a simple barber preparing to close shop. But Sheriff Parker saw how the man's weight had settled differently, how his movements had taken on a fluid quality that spoke of muscle memory deeper than any barbering school could install. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound of distant motorcycles broke the evening quiet, their rumble echoing off Pine Grove's brick buildings like approaching thunder. James continued, wiping down his barber chair, his movements unchanged, but his eyes caught something in the mirror's reflection. Sarah stepping out of the diner, her face pale with concern. Through the window, he watched Deputy Marshal hurrying down the street, gathering stragglers and urging them inside. The young lawman moved with purpose, but James could read the fear in his posture. Cedar Creek's dead deputies had probably been friends of his. "Rider coming," Dr. Wilson announced from his position by the window. He'd returned despite the growing danger, his medical bag now resting conspicuously near James's workstation. Moving fast. James's hands remained steady as he arranged his tools for tomorrow, but his stance shifted ever so slightly. To most, he still looked like nothing more than a simple barber preparing for closing time. But Dr. Wilson saw how the man's weight had settled on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. The sound of galloping hooves grew louder, then stopped abruptly outside the barbershop. The bell chimed violently as young Tommy from the telegraph office burst in, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Sheriff! Sheriff Parker, they're coming! The Hawkins brothers. They just shot up the Morrison ranch, killed 2 hands who tried to stop them. They're headed this way." In the sudden silence that followed, James carefully set down the straight razor he was polishing. His movements were still measured, still precise, but now they carried an entirely different quality, like a coiled spring slowly releasing. "How far?" Parker demanded. "Hour, maybe less." Tommy swallowed hard, his voice cracking. "They're moving fast and they're killing anyone who looks at them wrong." Sarah's hand went to her throat as she stepped into the shop. "Mother of God." "Get word to everyone," Parker ordered, turning to Tommy. "Tell them to bar their doors and windows. Nobody on the streets after dark." He turned to James. "Might want to close up early tonight." "No." James's quiet voice cut through the tension like a well-honed blade. "Keep the shop open, just like any other night." They all turned to look at him, but his eyes were fixed on something distant, seeing perhaps not the neat row of combs and scissors before him, but something from long ago, something through a rifle scope in the rain. "James," Sarah's voice held a question, a plea. "Some folks need to learn," he said softly, "that the deadliest shots are fired from steady hands." Evening crept into Pine Grove like a thief, bringing with it an unseasonal chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Miller's Barbershop maintained its usual appearance, but tension hung in the air as thick as the scent of talcum powder and aftershave. Mrs. Chen's violin had fallen silent, its absence a warning that everyone felt but nobody mentioned. Sheriff Parker had positioned himself by the window, occasionally glancing down the darkening street. The few remaining citizens who hadn't fled to their homes huddled in the diner across the street, speaking in whispers as if afraid their voices might carry beyond its walls. Even old Pete McCarthy had sobered up enough to notice the change in atmosphere, his rheumy eyes darting between the door and James's steady presence at his workstation. "Two riders coming in from the east," Parker announced, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. The shop fell silent, save for the soft metallic sounds as James continued preparing his tools. The riders turned out to be nothing more than traveling salesmen seeking shelter for the night, but their news brought no comfort. "Passed through Morrison's ranch this morning," the older of the two men said, hands shaking slightly as he settled into the barber chair. "Never seen anything like it. They didn't just rob the place, they made examples of anyone who stood up to them. Old man Morrison, he—" The salesman trailed off, unable to continue. Dr. Wilson, who had returned despite the growing danger, spoke up from his corner. "How many dead?" "5 that I counted," the younger salesman replied. "Would have been more, but it seems they wanted to leave enough folks alive to spread the word about what happens when you stand up to the Hawkins brothers." James's movements had slowed almost imperceptibly as he listened. To most, he appeared absorbed in his task of arranging his tools, but Sarah noticed how his right hand kept straying to a spot beneath the counter where she knew a locked case had rested unused for the past 5 years. The younger salesman, trying to lighten the mood, attempted a joke. "Lucky for us, we've got a sheriff here, right? Though I reckon even the law might want to think twice about facing Marcus Hawkins. They say he can shoot a dime at 50 paces. A strange sound came from behind the counter, something between a scoff and a sigh. All eyes turned to James, who had paused in his work. "Something funny about that, Barber?" the young man asked, a slight edge to his voice. 50 paces, James said quietly, resuming his task. "Man who brags about 50 paces hasn't spent much time behind a real rifle." "That's enough," Sarah cut in sharply. "James, could you check the back room? I think we're running low on that special bay rum you order." James nodded and moved toward the storage door. As he passed Dr. Wilson's chair, the physician spoke in a voice only James could hear. "Your old injury bothering you?" "Not yet," James replied softly. "But it will be." The bell above the door chimed again as 2 more locals hurried in, their faces pale with fresh news. "Sheriff," the first man gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "Found Mike Sullivan's boy out by Copper Creek. Shot clean through, precision shot, military style. His horse was still saddled." The news hit the room like a physical blow. Tommy Sullivan was barely 19, home on leave from the army. He'd stopped by the Barbershop just last week, proudly showing James his new sergeant's stripes. The boy had talked about his deployment, about wanting to make a difference, about following in the footsteps of men like James, though he couldn't have known the true weight of those words. "They're closer than we thought," Parker grimaced, his hand tightening on his holster. "James, maybe now's the time to—" The sound of breaking glass cut through the air as the younger salesman dropped his coffee cup, but it wasn't the noise that silenced the room, it was what followed. From somewhere in the darkness outside came the distant but unmistakable sound of motorcycles, followed by raucous laughter that carried no mirth. James emerged from the back room, his face impossible to read, but there was something different about him now, something in the way he moved, as if the quiet barber was slowly falling away like an ill-fitting coat. His steps had taken on a fluid quality that spoke of years of training, the kind you couldn't get in any barbering school. "Sheriff," he said, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been there before, "you might want to get these folks home while they still can." Through the window, the street had emptied, leaving only shadows and the echo of distant engines. The diner's neon sign flickered, casting intermittent red glows across the vacant sidewalk where Mrs. Chen's daughter had been practicing her violin just hours ago. The contrast between the peaceful afternoon and the approaching storm wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Parker studied James for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, everyone out. Head straight home, bar your doors." He turned to Sarah. "You too." "This is my street." She started to protest, but James interrupted. "Please, Miss Sarah, for once, don't argue." Something in his tone made her pause. She'd never heard him speak that way before, like a man who knew exactly what was coming and had seen it all before. It was the voice of someone who had witnessed things that couldn't be unsaid, couldn't be unforgotten. As the patrons hurriedly filed out, Dr. Wilson lingered, his medical bag still conspicuously placed near James's workstation. The weight of unspoken understanding passed between them. "Need any help?" "Best get your medical supplies ready, Doc," James replied, beginning to move items from the counter to below it. His movements were precise, economical. The same efficiency he brought to cutting hair now applied to preparing for something far more serious. "Something tells me you'll need them before morning." The sound of motorcycles came again, closer this time, accompanied by the wild whoops of men who had left their humanity somewhere in the dust of their trail. The Hawkins brothers were coming, and with them, the end of peace in Pine Grove. As Sarah finally allowed herself to be led out by Sheriff Parker, she looked back at James. He stood at his workstation, as he had countless times before. But now she saw what she'd been blind to all these years, the way he held himself, the deliberate precision of his movements, the watchful eyes that missed nothing. This wasn't just a man who'd seen combat. This was a man who had once been the combat itself. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror, and for a moment, his posture reminded her of something she'd seen in a military documentary. A sniper, perfectly still, waiting for the perfect shot. The comparison sent a chill down her spine as she remembered all the little things she'd noticed over the years. How he always positioned himself with clear lines of sight to all entrances. How his eyes constantly scanned reflections in the mirrors. How he knew the exact distance to every point in town, as if he'd ranged it all personally. The Hawkins gang didn't so much enter Pine Grove as they infected it, their arrival bringing a silence that swept through the streets like a prairie fire, extinguishing all signs of life. Only Miller's Barbershop remained lit, a beacon in the growing darkness, its warm light spilling onto the empty street like a challenge. James heard them before he saw them, the synchronized rumble of 5 motorcycles moving at a deliberate pace, not the hurried approach of men running from the law, but the confident stride of predators who feared nothing in their path. He continued arranging his tools, his movements unchanged, as the sound of boots and heavy footsteps grew louder on the wooden sidewalk outside. The bell above the door chimed one final time, not the gentle ring of a normal customer, but the violent clang of men who thought breaking things made them strong. Marcus Hawkins entered first, a towering figure with cold eyes and a leather vest adorned with military patches he hadn't earned. Behind him came his brothers, Tyler, lean and cruel, and Ray, the youngest, trying too hard to match his siblings' swagger. The 2 ex-cons, Drake and Wilson, brought up the rear, their prison tattoos visible beneath rolled-up sleeves. "Well, ain't this cozy?" Marcus's voice carried the hint of educated roots gone to seed. "Seems most establishments in this charming town decided to close early. How hospitable of you to stay open for weary travelers." James set down his comb with careful precision. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "Gentlemen," Tyler laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Hear that, Marcus? He called us gentlemen." "A trim," Marcus declared, dropping into the barber chair and propping his boots on the armrest. "Make it quick and steady." The threat in his last words was unmistakable. James reached for his scissors, his movements measured and deliberate. He could feel their eyes on him, 5 sets of them watching for any sign of fear or resistance. He gave them neither. "You boys aren't from around here," James observed quietly, beginning to work on Marcus's hair with the same precision he'd shown all day. "What gave it away?" Ray grinned, fingering the hunting knife at his belt. "The way you carry yourselves," James replied, his scissors moving steadily. "Military wannabes. Real soldiers don't wear their gear like Halloween costumes." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly in the mirror. "You seem to know a lot about soldiers for a barber," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Man learns things." James shrugged, continuing his work without pause. Drake, the larger of the ex-cons, drew his pistol with a flourish. "Man learns things, huh? Learn anything about this?" He spun the gun around his finger, showing off. "Learn that's a good way to shoot yourself," James replied without looking up. "Or your friends. That's a Marine Corps M9. Safety's worn. Trigger pull's too light for tricks." The gang laughed, all except Marcus, who studied James with growing interest in the mirror. "You got a name, Barber?" "James. Just James." "Just James." Marcus nodded slowly, then without warning swept his arm across the counter, sending bottles and tools crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Well, just James. You know what I think? I think you're lying to me. And I don't like being lied to." James finally looked up, his face impassive. "Those bottles were $15 each." The brothers burst out laughing, but Marcus silenced them with a look. He approached the counter slowly, like a wolf closing in on prey. $15. That's steep for cheap product." He reached into his vest and pulled out a crumpled bill, flicking it onto the counter. "Here's 5. Buy yourself some manners." James looked at the money, then back at Marcus. "Still leaves $40. "Wilson," Marcus said softly, "show our friend here what we do to mouthy barbers." Wilson grinned and started forward, but at that moment the door swung open again. Sheriff Parker stood framed in the doorway, his badge catching the shop's warm light. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, calm as Sunday morning. "Might want to reconsider whatever you're thinking." "A sheriff?" Marcus's smile widened. "In this little dust heap must be our lucky day." "Way I hear it," Parker continued, stepping inside, "Morrison Ranch is missing some good people. You boys wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Can't say that we do," Marcus replied, though his stance had shifted subtly. "Though I did hear something interesting about Morrison Ranch. Heard their sheriff was a coward, hid behind his badge while good people died." His hand drifted toward his waistband. "You're not a coward, are you, Sheriff?" Everything happened at once. Parker's hand dropped to his holster, but Marcus was faster. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. Parker stumbled backward, red blooming across his chest. "Jack!" James's voice cracked for the first time, genuine emotion breaking through his careful facade. "Stay at your station," Parker gasped, then crumpled to the floor. Through it all, James hadn't moved from his position, but something had changed in his demeanor. His hands had stopped their careful work, his shoulders had straightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes had taken on a look that made even Wilson step back. "Been a long time since I watched a man die," James said softly, almost to himself. "Promised myself I was done with that life." "Kill him," Marcus ordered, annoyed by James's quiet defiance. "Kill him slowly." Wilson stepped forward again, cracking his knuckles, but this time something fundamental had changed in James's demeanor. His hands had stopped their methodical movements, his shoulders set in a way that spoke of years of combat training, and his eyes had taken on a look that made even Wilson hesitate. "You know what's interesting about barbering?" James asked, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "It teaches you about angles, about precision, about how the smallest movement can make the biggest difference." His fingers traced the edge of his scissors with deadly familiarity, kind of like long-range shooting. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another few degrees. Marcus's hand drifted back toward his weapon, but his cocky smile had faltered slightly. Looks like our quiet barber has some fight in him after all. Ray and Tyler spread out, flanking the workstation. Drake bounced on his toes, eager for action, but James stood perfectly still now, his eyes fixed on Parker's motionless form. The shop's lights cast multiple shadows across the floor, creating a complex geometry of angles and lines that James seemed to read like a map. "Last chance," he said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't possessed before. "Take your friend and ride out. Don't make me break my promise." Marcus's laugh was genuine this time. "Or what? You'll style us to death?" He drew his weapon with practiced speed. "I think it's time we—" The metallic sound of a bolt being worked cut through his words. James had produced something from beneath the counter, not a gun, but a laser rangefinder, military grade. The red dot danced on Marcus's chest as James set it carefully on the counter. The device was well worn, its black surface scratched and weathered, telling its own story of distant battlefields and impossible shots. "That what you had in mind all along?" Marcus's smile turned cold. "Playing soldier with your toys. Problem is, old man, you can only mark one of us before the others cut you down." "True," James agreed. Then with deliberate care he set the rangefinder aside. "That's why I won't be using it." His right hand dropped to his side, where no weapon had been visible moments before. But now somehow a well-worn M40A5 sniper rifle gleamed in the shop lights, as if it had materialized from thin air. The weapon was immaculate, maintained with the same precision James brought to his barbering tools. Its scope caught the light, reflecting the years of service that had made it an extension of its owner's will. "Been a while," James said softly, "since anyone called me the Ghost." The name fell into the room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition across the faces of the Hawkins gang. Even Wilson, still nursing his bruised ego, stopped his threatening advance. The nickname carried weight in certain circles, whispered stories of impossible shots taken in conditions that should have made them unfeasible. "The Ghost," Drake whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating. "That's just a story. They say he died in Fallujah, say he took half a Marine battalion through a sandstorm when they were pinned down by enemy snipers." "Stories," James said quietly, his rifle unwavering, "have a way of coming back to life, just like the men I was supposed to have saved that day, just like the ones I couldn't." Marcus's face had lost some of its color, but his arrogant smile remained fixed. "I heard of you. They say you made a 1,000-yard shot in a sandstorm. Say you could hit a man's trigger finger at 800 yards. That you never missed, not once, not even when it mattered most." "If I'd made impossible shots like that," James replied, "I wouldn't have bothered counting them. Real soldiers don't keep score. They just carry the weight of every shot, every decision, every life taken or saved." Ray and Tyler exchanged glances, their synchronized movements betraying their nervousness. They had spread out too far, trying to flank the workstation, and now found themselves exposed. The brothers realized too late that James had manipulated their positioning, using their own tactical training against them. "Boy," James addressed Drake without taking his eyes off Marcus, "I'm going to give you a chance your friends won't get. You're young enough to learn from mistakes. Walk out now, leave your weapons, and don't stop riding till you hit the state line. There's still time to choose a different path." Drake looked uncertain at Marcus, who spoke through clenched teeth. "You take one step toward that door, boy, and I'll kill you myself." Behind the counter, James shifted his weight slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it caused all 5 men to flinch. Years of combat experience had taught them to recognize the subtle signs that preceded violent action. "Last chance, kid. Be smart." For a moment, the young ex-con seemed to waver, then his face hardened. "No one calls me kid." His hand dropped to his gun. What happened next was so fast it seemed like a single motion. Drake drew his weapon, clearing leather with impressive speed, but James was faster. Impossibly faster. His first shot took Drake's gun hand, spinning the weapon away in a spray of blood. His second caught the man's shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. The precision of the shot spoke of years of training, of countless hours spent perfecting the art of controlled violence. The brothers drew their weapons in unison, their movements mirror images of each other. James's rifle seemed to speak twice more without him even looking in their direction. Both Ray and Tyler stumbled backward, clutching their gun arms, their weapons clattering to the floor. The sound echoed in the confined space, mixing with their pained gasps. "You've lost your edge, Ghost," Marcus sneered, though sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Time was you'd have killed them all. The legend's gone soft." "Still might," James replied calmly. "Depends on what happens next." Through his scope, he could see the minute tremors in Marcus's trigger finger, the slight dilation of his pupils, signs that told him more than any words could. These were the details that had kept him alive through 3 tours, the tiny tells that separated survivors from statistics. Wilson had managed to regain his feet, blood still dripping from where the rifle's stock had caught his face. His hand strayed toward his concealed backup weapon, but his movements were telegraphed by years of prison yard habits. The slight shift of weight, the tensing of shoulder muscles that James had seen countless times through his scope. "I wouldn't," James warned. "You're slower than the others, and this rifle's got more than enough rounds left." The M40A5 carries 5 rounds in the magazine, plus 1 in the chamber. Simple arithmetic tells you I've still got options. "One rifle against the 2 of us," Marcus laughed, but there was a hysterical edge to it. "Those aren't good odds, old man. Even the famous Ghost can't beat basic math." "Better than you think," James's eyes flickered to Parker's still form. "Jack was more than just a sheriff to me. He was there that day in Fallujah when I hung up my rifle, made me promise to stop killing, made me swear I'd find another way." His voice carried the weight of memories, of decisions made in sandstorms and darkness. His voice grew softer but somehow more dangerous. "But he's bleeding out now, and that promise is getting weaker by the second. Just like another promise I made long ago to a different friend who bled out while I watched through a scope." A movement caught James's eye. Sarah stood in the doorway, Dr. Wilson's medical bag in her hands. She had returned despite his warnings, drawn by the sound of gunfire. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. She understood, stepping back into the shadows, but her presence reminded him of everything he had built here, everything these men threatened to destroy. "Fallujah," Marcus said slowly, recognition dawning. "That's where you saved that Marine battalion. 800 yards through a sandstorm, they say. Impossible shot that changed the course of the battle. The shot that made you a legend." 912 yards, James corrected, his voice carrying the precision that had made him legendary. "People always forget about the wind adjustment. Had to compensate for a 15-knot crosswind, elevation change, and Coriolis effect. The kind of shot you take once in a lifetime, if you're lucky, or unlucky." He adjusted his grip slightly. "And now you're about to make 10. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that danced across the worn linoleum floor. Through his scope, James could read every micro-expression on Marcus's face, the doubt, the fear, the desperate calculation of odds that no longer favored him. "Wrong!" Wilson spat blood onto the perfectly swept floor. "How the mighty have fallen! The ghost of Fallujah cutting hair in a backwater town. What happened to the man who could drop an entire enemy squad before they knew where the shots came from?" "Man needs peace," James replied. "I found mine here, until you brought war to my door. 5 years I've spent building something that doesn't end in blood and brass casings. 5 years of choosing life over death. Outside, a car alarm continued its rhythmic wailing, its electronic shriek punctuating the tension inside Miller's barbershop. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the scene. Drake writhing on the floor, clutching his wounded hand. The Reed brothers leaning against the wall, their bravado replaced by pain. And Marcus Hawkins, self-proclaimed leader, realizing too late that he had severely miscalculated. "Way I see it," Marcus said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone that didn't match the desperation in his eyes. "We're at a stalemate. You're good, maybe the best there ever was, but you can't watch all of us at once. The minute you turn to shoot one, the other will put you down." "True," James agreed, "if I were still the man who needed to outdraw his enemies." He nodded toward something behind the counter. "But I own a barbershop now, and a barber, well, he likes to keep his tools organized, likes to have systems in place." Marcus's eyes widened as he spotted the thin wire running from behind the counter to several strategic points around the shop. Tripwires connected to mechanisms James had installed years ago, always preparing, always ready. The setup spoke of a mind that never truly left the battlefield, that saw every space as a potential combat zone. "First man to move," James explained quietly. "Triggers the whole system. Won't even need to aim after that." He shrugged. "Like you said, one rifle, but plenty of rounds left." Dirtus. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the wounded had stopped their moaning, sensing the tension building toward its breaking point. Through the window, James could see more shadows gathering, townspeople drawn by the commotion but keeping their distance, watching their quiet barber transform into something else entirely. "You know what they never tell you about being a sniper," James continued, his voice carrying across the room like a professor giving a lecture. "It's not about the shot. It's about the waiting, the patience, learning to read people from a distance, understanding their patterns, their habits." He adjusted his grip on the rifle slightly, the movement so smooth it seemed almost casual. 5 years serving this town, I've learned more about human nature than I ever did looking through a scope. Learned how a man holds himself when he's afraid, but trying to hide it like you are now, Marcus. Marcus's face darkened, but James saw the telltale tightening around his eyes. "You think knowing psychology makes you invincible?" "No," James replied, "but it means I can do this." His rifle disappeared from sight as he turned his back on Marcus, walking to his workstation with measured steps. Behind him, Marcus's hand darted toward his secondary weapon. "I wouldn't," James said without turning. "Your weight's on your back foot. You'd miss, and the tripwire by your left boot would ensure it was your last mistake." Marcus's hand froze, his face a mask of frustrated rage. "You're just guessing." "Am I?" James picked up a straight razor, examined its edge in the light. "Your breathing changed, shortened. Your boot heels scraped the floor when you shifted your weight. The floorboard under your right foot creaked." He turned, holding the razor like he would hold it during a normal day's work. "Little things, things most men never notice." "But Jack noticed them," he continued, gesturing to the sheriff's still form. "Taught me to notice them too. Turned me from a weapon into something else entirely. Taught me that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to understand your opponent so well they defeat themselves." Dr. Wilson's voice cut through the tension coming from near Parker. "I've got the bleeding under control, but he needs a hospital soon." James nodded without taking his eyes off Marcus. "Hear that? Jack's alive, which means I still have a choice to make. The question is, do you understand what that choice might be?" Wilson, seeing an opening, spoke up again. "I know what a man looks like when he's about to do something stupid, Marcus. Seen it too many times in the yard. The way your hand keeps twitching, the sweat on your upper lip. You're thinking about trying something desperate." "Shut up," Marcus snarled, but his voice shook slightly. 5 years, James said softly. 5 years I've watched men like you plan desperate things. Saw it in their eyes, their hands, the way they looked at their weapons like they were lifelines, instead of what they really are, tools of last resort. He set the razor down with deliberate care. "Want to know what else I learned in those 5 years?" A subtle shift occurred in the barbershop's atmosphere as James stood perfectly still, his presence somehow filling the space more completely than before. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting multiple shadows that seemed to dance across the floor like memories of past battles. The air grew thick with tension, carrying the metallic scent of blood mixed with the familiar aromas of bay rum and talcum powder. Through the large front window, the town's main street lay eerily empty, the evening shadows growing longer as the sun began its final descent. "What I learned," James continued, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "is that violence has a language all its own. In Fallujah, we called it reading the battlefield. Each movement, each sound, each shadow telling its own story. Here in this shop, I've spent 5 years reading a different kind of battlefield, one made of everyday choices and quiet desperations." Marcus's finger twitched near his trigger, but James noticed how his eyes kept darting to the various tripwires now visible in the shop's harsh lighting. The once confident gang leader's composure had begun to crack, showing glimpses of the frightened man beneath the brutal facade. His leather vest, adorned with unearned military patches, suddenly seemed like a child's costume rather than the mark of authority he'd intended it to be. "Spare me the philosophy lesson, Ghost," Marcus spat, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "You're not the first killer to hide behind pretty words. We've all got our stories, our reasons. Every man in here's got blood on his hands." "Not hiding," James replied, moving slightly to maintain his line of sight on both Marcus and Wilson. His movements were precise, economical. The same efficiency he brought to cutting hair now applied to controlling the space around him. The mirror behind him reflected the scene in duplicate, creating a kaleidoscope of tensions and angles that only he seemed able to read. "For the first time in years, I'm standing exactly where I need to be. You see, Jack taught me something valuable that day in Fallujah, something you still haven't learned, the difference between being capable of violence and being defined by it." Through the window, more townspeople had gathered at a safe distance. Among them, James spotted Mrs. Chen clutching her daughter close, the violin case still in the girl's hands. The sight reminded him of another time, another place, where music had been replaced by the whistle of incoming mortars. He remembered the weight of his rifle then, the responsibility of protecting not just his fellow Marines, but the civilians caught in the crossfire. The memory strengthened his resolve. He'd chosen this town, these people, this life of peace, and he would defend it with the same precision he'd once used to take lives. "Your reputation," Marcus continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone as he tested the waters, "says you never miss, never waste a shot, but you just used 4 rounds and we're all still breathing. The ghost I heard about wouldn't have left witnesses. He'd have painted the walls with us by now. They say you once took out an entire enemy cell without a single wasted round." "Wasn't trying to kill you," James replied evenly, his eyes tracking every minute movement in the room. The mirrors had become his allies, giving him a complete view of the space, eliminating blind spots that lesser men might have missed. "Not yet." His gaze moved to Dr. Wilson, who was still working on Parker. The doctor gave a subtle nod. The sheriff would live provided he got proper medical attention soon. The knowledge steadied James's resolve, reminding him that not all battles had to end in death. The wounded men groaned softly in the corner, their blood slowly staining the pristine floor. Drake's breathing had become labored, his face pale from blood loss. The Reed brothers huddled together, their earlier bravado replaced by the quiet acceptance of men who knew they'd chosen the wrong path. Wilson kept shifting his weight, his prison instincts telling him to run, while his fear of Marcus kept him rooted in place. "You know what else is interesting about barbering?" James asked, reaching down to adjust one of his fallen tools. The movement caused both Marcus and Wilson to flinch, their nerves frayed by the prolonged tension. Every gesture, every word was calculated now, part of a larger strategy that James had perfected over years of combat and peace. It teaches you about pressure points, about the vulnerable spots that every man carries, no matter how tough he thinks he is, about how the smallest touch in the right place can bring the strongest man to his knees. He straightened up slowly, his movements fluid and controlled, reminiscent of the precision that had once made him legendary among snipers. The evening light filtering through the windows cast long shadows across his face, highlighting years of experience etched into every line. The barbershop's familiar space had transformed into something else entirely, no longer just a place of daily commerce, but a battlefield where every position, every angle, every reflection held tactical significance. "Like how your shoulder's starting to ache, Marcus. Old injury, probably. The way you've been favoring it tells me it never healed right. Military discharge, maybe, or something less honorable." James's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent years studying human vulnerabilities, both physical and psychological. The question struck a nerve. Marcus's face tightened, confirming James's assessment. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. His hand gripped his weapon tighter, knuckles turning white with tension. The confident facade that had terrorized 3 counties was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of the wounded man beneath. "You don't know anything about me," he growled, but the words carried more desperation than menace. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their steady hum underlining the growing tension in the room. In the corner, Dr. Wilson continued his careful work on Sheriff Parker, his movements deliberate and focused, despite the danger surrounding them. "I know you're trying to live up to your father's reputation," James said softly, his voice carrying across the room like a confession. "Know you've spent years trying to prove you're just as brutal, just as fearsome. But here's what I learned from 5 years of watching men in my chair. Sons who try to become their fathers usually end up destroying themselves. The weight of that legacy becomes a noose. I've seen it in every mirror in this shop, reflected in the eyes of men trying to outrun their own shadows." Marcus's hand trembled slightly on his weapon, a tell that spoke volumes to James's trained eye. Behind him, Wilson shifted uncomfortably, recognizing truths in James's words that hit too close to home. The mirrors around the shop reflected their expressions from multiple angles, creating a kaleidoscope of contained violence and barely suppressed fear. Each reflection seemed to tell its own story of choices made and paths not taken. "You think you can just talk your way out of this?" Marcus demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Think you understand me because you've got some fancy military training and can read people? You're just another has-been trying to sound important. A legend who couldn't cut it anymore, hiding behind scissors and combs." "No," James replied, adjusting his stance slightly. The movement was almost imperceptible, but it gave him better angles on both remaining threats while keeping him clear of his own tripwires. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their steady drone a counterpoint to the tension in the room. "I understand you because I've been you, trying to live up to impossible expectations, trying to prove something to ghosts that won't listen. The difference is, I found another way, a better way." Through the shop window, James could see more movement on the street. State police would be arriving soon, but he knew this would end before they got here one way or another. The setting sun painted the shop in shades of amber and shadow, turning the mirrors into portals to darker places, reflecting not just the present scene, but echoes of past violence. Each reflection seemed to show a different version of the same story. Men trapped by their own choices, their own need to prove themselves through violence. "You know what they never tell you about being a sniper?" James continued, his voice taking on an almost instructional tone. The same voice he used when teaching young apprentices how to hold their first razor, but now laden with deeper meaning. It's not about the shot, it's about the waiting, about learning to read people from half a mile away, understanding their patterns, their habits, their breaking points, about knowing when to take the shot, and more importantly, when not to, about understanding that every trigger pull changes not just the target, but the shooter too. Outside, the distant wail of sirens grew closer, but inside the barbershop, time seemed to stand still. The wounded men in the corner had grown quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. Even the usual evening sounds of Pine Grove, passing cars, chattering pedestrians, the distant whistle of the evening train, had fallen silent, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would end. A police siren wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing moment. Marcus's eyes darted to the door, then back to James, calculation warring with desperation in his expression. The mirrors surrounding them reflected the scene from multiple angles, each one telling its own version of the story unfolding in the small barbershop. The evening light cast long shadows across the worn linoleum floor, turning familiar corners into potential hiding spots and escape routes. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily overhead, their harsh illumination revealing every detail of the tense tableau, the scattered tools from James's workstation, the small pools of blood where the wounded lay, the fine sheen of sweat on Marcus's forehead as he fought to maintain his composure. Behind him, Wilson had begun to edge toward the rear exit, his prison-honed instincts telling him the tide was turning. "You trying to buy time, Ghost?" Marcus's voice carried a tremor he couldn't quite hide. "Waiting for backup to save you from making the hard choices?" The question hung in the air, weighted with the desperation of a man running out of options. His leather vest, adorned with unearned military patches, seemed to weigh heavier on his shoulders with each passing moment. "Don't need backup," James replied calmly, his posture relaxed but alert. "Everything that's going to happen in this room will be over long before they get here. You've already told me how this ends. You just don't know it yet." His eyes never left Marcus, but his awareness encompassed the entire room. Wilson's subtle movements, Dr. Wilson's steady work on Parker, the play of shadows across the floor, marking potential escape routes and danger zones. The air in the barbershop had grown thick with tension and the metallic scent of blood. The familiar smells of aftershave and talcum powder seemed to belong to another world now, one that felt increasingly distant with each passing moment. In the corner, Drake's labored breathing had steadied somewhat, though his face remained pale from blood loss. The Reed brothers hadn't moved from their positions, their earlier bravado replaced by the quiet acceptance of men who recognized when they'd been outmaneuvered. Dr. Wilson spoke up from where he was tending to Parker, his voice carrying the professional detachment of someone who had seen too many violent ends. "The sheriff's stable, but he needs a hospital within the hour. The bullet missed his major arteries, but he's lost a lot of blood." The doctor's hands remained steady as he worked, a counterpoint to the tension filling the room. "And these other wounds need proper attention soon, or we're looking at complications I'd rather not have to explain to the state medical board." James nodded without taking his eyes off Marcus. "Hear that? Clock's ticking. Time to make a choice. The same choice Jack gave me in Fallujah when I was ready to lose myself completely. The choice between being remembered as just another violent end to a violent story, or as something else entirely." His words carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned through years of watching life through a scope. Through the window, the last rays of sunlight painted the street in shades of gold and shadow. James could see more townspeople gathering at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. Sarah stood among them, her presence a reminder of everything he had built in Pine Grove, everything these men threatened to destroy. Behind her, he could see Mrs. Chen holding her daughter close, the violin case a poignant reminder of the peace that had been shattered. The distant sirens grew louder, their wail mixing with the steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the labored breathing of the wounded men. Time seemed to compress in the small space, each second stretching out like the moment before a crucial shot, when breath and heartbeat and target all align into perfect clarity. "What choice?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The bravado had drained from his stance, leaving behind something more vulnerable, more human. In the harsh, fluorescent light, he suddenly looked younger, more like the boy he must have been before violence became his answer to everything. "What did he offer you?" "Redemption," James replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of a man who had walked through darkness and found his way back to light. The words seemed to echo in the barbershop's tense atmosphere, bouncing off mirrors and mingling with the distant sirens. "A chance to use my skills to protect instead of destroy, to build something instead of tearing it down." The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Marcus's face as he processed James's words. In those shadows, James could see the weight of expectations, a father's legacy of violence, years of trying to prove something that never needed proving. The barbershop's mirrors reflected their standoff from multiple angles, each reflection telling its own version of the story. "You don't understand," Marcus said, desperation creeping into his voice. His hand tightened on his weapon, but the movement lacked conviction. "You don't know what it's like to have his shadow hanging over you, to hear his voice in your head telling you you'll never measure up. Your father was a killer," James interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. The evening light streaming through the windows had taken on a golden quality, painting the scene in amber hues that seemed to soften the harsh reality of their situation. "A man who measured his worth in blood and fear. But you don't have to be. That's what I learned in this shop, cutting hair, listening to stories, becoming part of something bigger than myself." Dr. Wilson continued his methodical work on Sheriff Parker, his steady hands a stark contrast to the trembling tension that filled the room. The doctor's movement spoke of years of experience dealing with the aftermath of violence, of putting broken things back together. "Pressure's holding steady," he reported quietly, "but we're working against time here. These men need proper medical attention soon." "Ah?" The air in the barbershop grew heavier with each passing moment, thick with the scent of gun oil and aftershave, an odd mixture of violence and normalcy. Outside, the gathering crowd had grown larger, their murmured conversations creating a low buzz that filtered through the windows. The late evening sun cast long shadows through the plate glass, turning familiar objects into dark silhouettes. James acknowledged the doctor's information with a slight nod, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "In Fallujah," he continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a story often remembered but rarely shared, "I was like you. Thought being the best meant never showing mercy, never hesitating, had more confirmed kills than any sniper in the theater. They called me Ghost because the enemy never saw me coming, never had a chance." The sirens were closer now, their wailing a counterpoint to the heavy silence in the shop. Wilson had stopped his slow retreat toward the door, James's words finding purchase in soil he thought had gone barren years ago. Even the wounded men seemed to be listening, their pain momentarily forgotten as they recognized something of themselves in the story. "But you know what I learned?" James's voice dropped lower, forcing everyone to lean in slightly to hear. "The hardest shot I ever took wasn't through a scope. It was looking in the mirror every morning, seeing what I'd become, and choosing to be something different. Jack understood that. He saw past the ghost, saw the man I could be instead of the weapon I'd become. Through the window, James could see more townspeople gathering, drawn by the commotion but keeping their distance. Sarah stood among them, her face a mixture of concern and determination. She had been the first to welcome him to Pine Grove, the first to see past his carefully constructed facade and offer friendship instead of fear. Behind her, other familiar faces watched and waited. Mr. Thompson from the hardware store, young Tommy from the telegraph office, even old Pete McCarthy, who usually never stayed out past sunset. Each man who sits in that chair, James gestured to his barber chair, now turned slightly askew in the earlier chaos, has a choice to make, to carry forward the weight of the past or to set it down and walk a different path. Every day I make that choice. Every haircut, every conversation, every moment of peace is a victory over what I used to be. The last rays of sunlight caught the metal of Marcus's gun, creating a brief flash that reminded James of scope glint in the desert. But this wasn't Fallujah, and Marcus wasn't an enemy combatant viewed through crosshairs. He was something far more complicated, a mirror of what James might have become without Jack's intervention, without the chance at redemption that Pine Grove had offered. "Tell me something, Marcus," James continued, his voice steady and measured. "When you were planning this, targeting small towns, terrorizing innocent people, what was the end game? What were you hoping to prove?" The questions hung in the air, weighted with purpose and understanding. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to deepen the lines of exhaustion on Marcus's face. Behind him, Wilson had completely abandoned his attempt to reach the door, transfixed by the conversation unfolding before him. The ex-con's prison-hardened expression had softened almost imperceptibly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "My father," Marcus started, then stopped, his voice catching. He swallowed hard, the gun in his hand trembling slightly. "My father said respect comes from fear, said a man's not worth anything unless people are afraid of him. I thought if I could make them fear me more than they feared him." "But it's never enough, is it?" James asked softly. The evening shadows had lengthened across the barbershop floor, turning the familiar space into something almost dreamlike. "No matter how many people you terrorize, no matter how many lives you destroy, that voice in your head keeps telling you you're not measuring up." Dr. Wilson spoke up again from where he worked on Parker, blood pressures dropping slightly. "We need to move him soon." The doctor's voice carried professional urgency, but there was something else there too, understanding perhaps of the delicate moment unfolding before him. Through the windows, James could see the flashing lights of approaching police cars, reflecting off the buildings across the street. Their red and blue pulses created an almost hypnotic pattern in the gathering dusk. The crowd outside had grown larger, but maintained their distance, sensing that whatever was happening inside the barbershop needed to play out without interference. "You know what the hardest part of being a sniper is?" James asked, adjusting his stance slightly. The movement was casual, but it gave him a clearer line of sight to both Marcus and Wilson, while keeping him aware of the wounded men in the corner. "It's not the shooting, it's not even the waiting. It's the weight of knowing that every time you pull that trigger, you're not just ending a life, you're changing your own." Sarah appeared briefly in the doorway, catching James's eye. She held up 5 fingers, 5 minutes until the state police arrived. James acknowledged her with the slightest nod, never taking his attention fully off Marcus. The timeline was shrinking, but he could see the cracks forming in Marcus's facade, could read the subtle signs of a man on the verge of making a crucial decision. "In Fallujah," James continued, his voice taking on a tone of shared confidence, "I made a shot that earned me my reputation. 912 yards through a sandstorm to save a pinned-down Marine unit. They called it impossible, called me a hero. But you know what I remember most about that day? Marcus's gun had lowered slightly, though he might not have been aware of it. What? The weight of it. Not just the shot itself, but knowing that from that moment on, people would look at me differently, would expect things from me, would see the legend instead of the man. Sound familiar? The words struck home. Marcus's breath caught audibly, and for a moment, James saw not the hardened criminal who had terrorized 3 counties, but the boy who had grown up under the shadow of a violent legacy, trying desperately to become something he was never meant to be. Marcus was silent for a long moment, the weight of revelation visible in his stance. The barbershop's mirrors reflected his expression from multiple angles, each one showing a different facet of a man confronting hard truths. The evening shadows had deepened, turning the familiar space into something liminal. Not quite the peaceful shop it had been that morning, but no longer the battlefield it had become. "Your father's legacy," James continued, his voice carrying the measured tone of experience. "It's like looking through a scope. The longer you focus on it, the narrower your world becomes. Everything else fades away until all you can see is that one point, that one goal. But there's always a choice to lower the rifle, to look up and see the whole world again." The sirens had grown closer, their wailing now unmistakable. Through the windows, the flashing lights painted the interior in alternating patterns of red and blue, creating an almost stroboscopic effect. Dr. Wilson continued his steady work on Parker, his movements precise and economical, though his attention was clearly divided between his patient and the unfolding drama. 5 minutes, Sarah called softly from the doorway. "State police are setting up a perimeter." James acknowledged the information with a slight nod, never taking his eyes off Marcus. The gang leader's weapon had lowered further, though he might not have realized it. His earlier bravado had crumbled completely, leaving behind something raw and uncertain. "You know what Jack taught me?" James asked, his voice taking on an almost contemplative quality. "He taught me that the hardest battles aren't won with bullets. They're won in moments like this, when a man has to choose between the path he's on and the path he could take." Wilson, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. His voice carried the rough edge of someone unused to vulnerability. "In prison," he said, "they tell you there's no going back, that once you're marked as violent, that's all you'll ever be. Is that true?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. James could see the same uncertainty reflected in Marcus's eyes, in the way he held himself, in the slight tremor of his gun hand. The wounded men in the corner had grown still, listening intently. "No," James replied firmly. "That's the lie we tell ourselves to justify staying on the path we're on. Every day, every moment, we have the choice to be something different. I made that choice in Fallujah. Jack helped me make it again here in Pine Grove. And now, right here in this shop, you have the same choice." The evening light had faded almost completely now, leaving the fluorescent lights to cast their harsh illumination over the scene. Outside, James could hear the methodical deployment of state police units, the quiet efficiency of men preparing for conflict. But inside the barbershop, something different was taking shape. "Your father," James said to Marcus, his voice gentle but firm. "He's been dead for 5 years. The man who killed him, the ghost you came looking for, he died that same day. We both have a chance to be something other than shadows of violent men. The question is, are you ready to take it?" Marcus's breathing had grown unsteady, his composure cracking further with each word. The gun in his hand seemed to weigh heavier by the moment, as if the metal itself was pulling him down. Behind him, Wilson had moved away from the door, his prison-hardened features showing the first real signs of hope James had seen. "They'll never let us walk away," Marcus said, but the words lacked conviction. "After everything we've done." "No," James agreed. But there's a difference between facing consequences and letting them define you. Trust me on that. I've walked that road. The tension in the barbershop had shifted, transforming from the brittle anticipation of violence to something more contemplative. Through the windows, the flashing lights of police vehicles created a rhythmic pattern of illumination, painting the scene in alternating shades of red and blue. The familiar space, with its mirrors and memories, had become a crucible where paths diverged and choices crystallized. "Tell me about Fallujah," Marcus said suddenly, his voice carrying an undertone of desperate need. "Tell me how you did it, how you walked away from being the ghost." His gun hand had lowered completely now, though he seemed unaware of the movement. Behind him, Wilson had shifted closer, equally intent on the answer. James studied their reflections in the surrounding mirrors, reading the subtle signs of men on the precipice of change. The evening had deepened outside, but the fluorescent lights cast their unwavering illumination over the scene, eliminating shadows where doubt might hide. "It wasn't one moment," James began, his voice measured and clear. "Wasn't like laying down a weapon and walking away. The hardest part was understanding that the ghost, the legend, the killer, the man who never missed, he was a shield I'd built around myself. Letting him go meant being vulnerable again." Dr. Wilson continued his methodical work on Parker, but his movements had slowed slightly, his attention divided between his patient and the unfolding conversation. The wounded men in the corner remained silent, their earlier bravado replaced by attentive stillness. "Jack found me after my last mission," James continued, the memories as clear as the mirrors surrounding them. "I'd made an impossible shot to save his unit, but the cost was watching another young man die because he thought violence was the only path to respect. Sound familiar?" Marcus's breath caught audibly. Outside, the deployment of state police continued with professional efficiency, but inside the barbershop, time seemed to move differently, shaped by the weight of shared understanding. "He didn't try to arrest me," James said, his eyes meeting Marcus's in the mirror. "Didn't reach for his weapon or quote regulations. Instead, he sat down next to me in that dusty bar in Fallujah and asked me a simple question. 'What do you see when you look in the mirror?' The words hung in the air, multiplied by the reflective surfaces surrounding them. Each mirror seemed to show a different version of the same scene, past and present overlapping in the fluorescent light." "I couldn't answer him then," James admitted. "Hadn't really looked at myself in years. The ghost didn't need mirrors. He only needed crosshairs. But Jack, he understood something I didn't. He saw past the legend to the man underneath, the one who was tired of measuring his worth in confirmed kills and notches on a rifle stock." Sarah appeared briefly in the doorway again, signaling that time was growing short. The state police would make their move soon, but James could see the change taking shape in Marcus's posture, in Wilson's attentive stillness, in the way the very air in the barbershop seemed to hold its breath. "He offered me a choice," James continued, his voice carrying the weight of remembered transformation, "not just about laying down my rifle, but about who I wanted to be when I looked in the mirror each morning, about finding worth in creating instead of destroying, in building connections instead of taking lives." The barbershop's familiar tools, scissors, razors, combs, caught the light, their everyday purpose a stark contrast to the weapons that had dominated the evening. Each reflection showed the same scene from a different angle, creating a kaleidoscope of possibilities and choices. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily overhead as James watched understanding begin to take root in Marcus's eyes. The barbershop had become more than just a setting for their confrontation. It was a testament to the possibility of change, each mirror reflecting not just their present moment, but the paths that had led them here. "When you first arrive in a combat zone," James continued, his voice carrying the measured certainty of hard-earned wisdom, "they teach you about fields of fire, about maintaining situational awareness. But what they don't tell you is how that awareness changes you, how you start seeing threats everywhere, start measuring every situation in terms of tactical advantage. Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, recognition flickering across his features. Behind him, Wilson had settled into a stance of attentive stillness, the ex-con's usual restlessness replaced by something approaching peace. The wounded men in the corner remained quiet, but their attention was focused entirely on the conversation unfolding before them. 5 years ago, James said, gesturing to the familiar space around them. I couldn't have imagined this. Couldn't have pictured myself standing in one place, being part of a community, finding worth in something as simple as a perfect haircut or a quiet conversation. The ghost lived for the next mission, the next impossible shot. But Jack showed me something different. And through the windows, the police lights continued their steady rhythm, casting alternating patterns of red and blue across the worn linoleum floor. Dr. Wilson worked with focused efficiency on Parker, but his movements betrayed his investment in the unfolding dialogue. The doctor had been there from the beginning, had watched James build his new life one haircut at a time. He showed me that the same skills that made me deadly could make me valuable in other ways, James continued. The patience, the attention to detail, the ability to read people, they're the same skills that make a good barber, a good neighbor, a good man. The tools changed, but the discipline remained. Sarah appeared in the doorway again, her expression a mixture of concern and hope. 3 minutes, she whispered, but her voice carried in the quiet shop. The state police would make their move soon, and everyone in the room knew it. The knowledge added weight to each passing second. Your father? James addressed Marcus directly, noting how the younger man's grip had loosened on his weapon. He taught you that respect comes through fear, that a man's worth is measured in how many people are afraid of him. But look around you, at this town, at these people. They respected me before they ever knew about the ghost. They respected me because of who I chose to become, not who I used to be. The evening had deepened outside, but the shop's lights kept the darkness at bay. Each mirror seemed to capture a different aspect of the scene. Marcus's gradual transformation from threat to listener, Wilson's quiet contemplation, the wounded men's attentive stillness, and James himself, no longer the ghost, no longer just a barber, but something that encompassed both and transcended either. The hardest part, James said, his voice softening slightly, wasn't giving up the rifle. It was accepting that I could be more than what the war had made me, that the skills that made me a weapon could be turned to different purposes, that the same steady hands that once ended lives could be trusted to help people look their best, feel their best. In the tense silence of the barbershop, Marcus finally lowered his weapon completely, letting it hang loosely at his side. The gesture wasn't surrender, not yet, but rather the physical manifestation of internal transformation. The fluorescent lights continued their steady hum, casting harsh clarity over a scene balanced delicately between violence and redemption. But it's not that simple, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of his father's legacy. The things we've done, the people we've hurt, that doesn't just go away because we decide to change. You can't just wash blood off your hands with bay rum and aftershave. His words echoed off the mirrors, each reflection seeming to amplify their impact. James nodded, acknowledging the truth in Marcus's words. Through the windows, the police lights painted rhythmic patterns across the worn floor, a reminder of consequences waiting to be faced. Dr. Wilson continued his steady work on Parker, the sheriff's condition a tangible reminder of the evening's violence. You're right, James replied, his voice carrying the authority of experience. The past doesn't vanish. The ghost still visits me sometimes, in quiet moments when I'm alone with my thoughts. But that's not weakness. It's a reminder of why I chose this path. Every person who sits in my chair trusts me with a blade near their throat. That trust, freely given, is worth more than any fear I ever inspired. The sirens had fallen silent now, replaced by the methodical sounds of law enforcement positioning themselves around the building. Sarah's earlier warning echoed in their minds. Time was running short. But in the barbershop, something profound was taking shape, a transformation as delicate as it was powerful. In Fallujah, James continued, noting how both Marcus and Wilson leaned slightly forward to listen. I learned that the hardest targets aren't the ones you see through your scope. They're the ones you see in the mirror. Jack understood that. He saw past the ghost to the man underneath, the one who was tired of measuring his worth in confirmed kills. The wounded men in the corner had grown quiet, their earlier pain seemingly forgotten as they absorbed the unfolding dialogue. Even Drake, still pale from blood loss, watched with intense focus as his former leader stood on the precipice of change. When I first came to Pine Grove, James said, gesturing to the familiar space around them, people just saw a barber. They didn't know about the ghost, about Fallujah, about the lives I'd taken. They judged me on what I chose to become, not what I'd been. That's the gift this town gave me, the chance to be defined by my choices rather than my past. Through the window, James could see the gathering of law enforcement growing larger. Their time was running out, but he could read the subtle signs in Marcus's posture, in Wilson's attentive stillness, that indicated his words were finding their mark. The state police out there, James continued, his voice steady and clear, they're not just waiting for criminals. They're waiting to see which version of you walks out that door. The man your father tried to make you become, or the man you choose to be. The consequences will be the same either way, but the path forward, that's entirely up to you. A heavy silence filled the barbershop as Marcus processed James's words. The fluorescent lights cast unwavering illumination over the scene, while outside, the last traces of daylight had surrendered to evening's darkness. The police lights continued their rhythmic dance across the walls, a reminder of the approaching moment of decision. My father, Marcus began, his voice carrying a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. He always said that surrender was weakness, that backing down meant you were less than a man. His gun hung loosely at his side now, almost forgotten. The unearned military patches on his vest seemed to weigh heavier with each passing moment. James studied Marcus's reflection in the surrounding mirrors, reading the subtle signs of a man confronting fundamental truths about himself. Dr. Wilson had paused in his work on Parker, sensing the delicacy of the moment. Even the wounded men in the corner seemed to hold their breath, aware they were witnessing something profound. Your father was wrong, James replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of experience. The strongest choice I ever made was laying down my rifle, not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood what real strength looks like. It's not about making people fear you. It's about having the courage to become something better than what the world tried to make you. Through the windows, James could see more police units arriving, their lights adding to the kaleidoscope of color that painted the interior of his shop. Sarah stood among the gathering crowd, her presence a reminder of the community that had given him a chance at redemption. Behind her, he could see other familiar faces, people who had trusted him with their stories, their appearance, their everyday moments. In combat, James continued, noting how Wilson had drawn closer, equally engaged in the conversation, they teach you that hesitation gets you killed. But sometimes hesitation is exactly what you need. That pause, that moment of doubt, it's not weakness. It's your conscience trying to tell you something important. True. The sirens had fallen silent now, replaced by the methodical sounds of law enforcement positioning themselves around the building. The atmosphere in the barbershop had transformed, becoming something almost sacred, a space where change wasn't just possible, but palpable. "Look at your hands, Marcus," James instructed softly. "Really look at them. They're shaking, aren't they? Not from fear, but from the weight of every choice that led you here. I remember that feeling. The moment when you realize that everything you thought made you strong was actually making you smaller, turning you into something less than what you could be." Marcus looked down at his trembling hands, seeing them perhaps for the first time, not as weapons, but as instruments of choice. The gun seemed foreign now, disconnected from the person he was becoming in this moment. Wilson moved closer, his prison-hardened features softening with recognition of universal truths. "The ghost died in Fallujah," James said, his voice carrying across the quiet shop. "But the man beneath him lived on, found purpose in creating instead of destroying, found respect freely given instead of fear forcefully taken. That same choice is before you now. The police outside, the charges you'll face, that's all still coming. But how you face it, who you choose to become, that starts right here, in this moment." Through the barbershop windows, James could see the state police finalizing their positions. Time was growing short, but in the fluorescent-lit space, something profound was taking shape. Marcus stood motionless, his weapon now hanging forgotten at his side, while Wilson had moved to stand near him, both men caught in the gravity of impending transformation. 2 minutes, Sarah called softly from the doorway, her voice carrying both urgency and understanding. The evening had deepened outside, but inside the shop, clarity seemed to sharpen every detail, the gleam of professional tools arranged with military precision, the subtle play of light on mirrors that had witnessed countless transformations. "They're going to take us down hard," Wilson said, his prison-honed instincts surfacing, "after what we did at Morrison's ranch at Cedar Creek." His voice trailed off, the weight of consequences settling heavily in the air. The wounded men in the corner shifted uncomfortably, their own fates equally uncertain. James nodded, acknowledging the truth in Wilson's words. "Yes, they will. But how you walk out that door makes all the difference. Trust me on this. I've seen it from both sides. The man who surrenders out of understanding is different from the one who surrenders out of defeat. The police out there, they'll see it too." Dr. Wilson spoke up from where he worked on Parker, his steady hands never pausing in their task. "The sheriff's stable enough to move now. Whatever's going to happen needs to happen soon." His professional demeanor carried an undertone of urgency that everyone in the room understood. "In Fallujah," James continued, his voice measured and clear, "we had a saying, 'The mission isn't over until everyone's home.' I always thought it meant completing the objective, eliminating the target. But Jack taught me it meant something else, that every man deserves the chance to find his way back, to come home to himself." Marcus's breath caught slightly at these words. Outside, the police lights painted rhythmic patterns across the worn floor, each pulse a countdown to the moment of decision. The barbershop's mirrors reflected the scene from multiple angles, each one showing a different facet of the transformation unfolding within. "Your father's legacy," James said softly, noting how Marcus flinched slightly at the mention. "It's like a scope that only shows one target, one way forward. But lower that scope and the whole world opens up. The same skills that made you feared could make you valued. The same strength that you used to tear things down could be used to build something worthwhile." Sarah appeared again briefly, her expression a mixture of concern and hope. Through the windows, James could see the state police tactical team taking their final positions. The moment of decision was approaching with the inevitability of sunrise. "I can't promise you it will be easy," James continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The path back is longer than the path that led you here, but I can promise you this: every step you take away from what you were, toward what you could be, makes the next step easier. Each choice to be better, to be more than your father's son, strengthens that part of you that wants something different. In the charged atmosphere of the barbershop, the transformation that had begun with words approached its crucial moment. The fluorescent lights cast their unwavering illumination over a scene poised between past and future, while outside, the gathered law enforcement officers waited with professional patience. 1 minute, Sarah's voice carried from the doorway, waited with urgency. Dr. Wilson had finished stabilizing Parker, whose steady breathing provided a counterpoint to the tension filling the room. The wounded men in the corner remained silent, witnesses to a moment that would define not just their futures, but their understanding of what redemption truly meant. Marcus stood perfectly still, the weapon in his hand now seeming more burden than threat. His father's legacy, so carefully cultivated through violence and fear, had begun to crack, revealing glimpses of the man he might have become under different circumstances. Wilson remained close by, his prison-hardened exterior softened by recognition of universal truths. "Before you make your choice," James said, his voice carrying the measured certainty of experience, "understand this. Walking out that door into custody isn't surrender. It's the first step toward reclaiming who you are beneath all the violence and fear. The consequences of your actions are fixed, but their meaning, that's entirely up to you." Through the windows, the police lights painted alternating patterns of red and blue across the worn floor. Each mirror in the shop caught and reflected these lights, creating a kaleidoscope effect that seemed to fragment the moment into its component parts: choice, consequence, and possibility. "In Fallujah," James continued, noting how both men leaned slightly forward to listen, "every shot I took changed 2 lives, the target's and my own. Each confirmed kill added to the legend of the ghost, but subtracted something from the man beneath. It took Jack to help me see that the skills that made me deadly could be turned toward different purposes. The same steady hands, the same patience, the same ability to read people and situations. They could build instead of destroy." Dr. Wilson began preparing Parker for transport, his movements deliberate and professional. "The sheriff will make it," he announced quietly. "Sometimes second chances come disguised as moments like these." His words carried the weight of medical and human understanding, bridging the gap between physical and spiritual healing. "Your father," James addressed Marcus directly, "taught you that a man's worth is measured in fear. But fear is like a scope. It narrows your vision until all you can see is targets and threats. The hardest part of changing isn't laying down your weapon. It's learning to see the world without that narrowed vision. Learning to measure yourself by what you build rather than what you destroy." The police lights outside intensified, signaling imminent action. Sarah's presence in the doorway carried both warning and support. The moment of decision had arrived, bringing with it the weight of all that had been said and all that remained possible. "The ghost died in Fallujah," James said softly, "but the man beneath him found something better than legend. Found purpose in serving rather than destroying, in building community rather than inspiring fear. That same possibility stands before you now. The charges you face, the time you'll serve, that's the price of your past choices. But who you become, starting right here in this moment, that's the choice before you now." Marcus looked down at the weapon in his hand, seeing it perhaps for the first time, not as a source of power, but as a chain binding him to a legacy of violence. The fluorescent lights of the barbershop cast clear illumination over the scene, eliminating shadows where doubt might hide. In this moment of clarity, the choice before him seemed both impossible and inevitable. "Time's up," Sarah called softly from the doorway. Through the windows, the police lights painted rhythmic patterns across the worn floor, each pulse a heartbeat marking the transition from one life to another. Dr. Wilson had finished preparing Parker for transport, The sheriff's steady breathing, a reminder of both violence and resilience. With deliberate slowness, Marcus placed his weapon on the counter. The metal made a soft sound against the familiar surface where James had arranged his tools countless times before. Wilson followed suit, his movement carrying the weight of understanding rather than defeat. The wounded men in the corner remained silent, witnesses to a transformation as profound as any they had seen. "Your father," James said quietly, "would see this as weakness. But there's more strength in this moment than in all the violence that led you here. The hardest battles aren't won with weapons. They're won in moments like these, when a man chooses to become something more than what the world tried to make him." Through the windows, they could see the state police tactical team taking their final positions. The evening had deepened into full darkness, but inside the barbershop, something bright and profound had taken root. Each mirror reflected a different aspect of the scene, not just the physical surrender, but the deeper transformation it represented. "Remember what I told you about Fallujah," James continued, his voice steady and clear. "About how the ghost died there, but the man beneath him lived on. That same opportunity stands before you now. The path ahead won't be easy, but it leads somewhere worth going. Each step away from violence is a step towards something better." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "All those people we hurt," he said, his voice catching slightly. "All the lives we destroyed. That doesn't just go away because we choose differently now." "No, it doesn't," James agreed. "The consequences of our actions remain, but how we face those consequences, who we choose to become while facing them, that's where redemption begins. Jack taught me that. Now I'm teaching you." Sarah stepped fully into the doorway, her presence both warning and witness. "They're ready," she said simply. The moment had arrived, bringing with it the weight of all that had been said and all that remained possible. "When you walk out that door," James said, addressing both Marcus and Wilson, "you're not just surrendering to the law. You're choosing to become something different than what you were. The path won't be easy, but it's better than the one you were on. Remember that in the days ahead." The police lights outside cast their alternating glow through the windows, painting the scene in shades of transformation. Marcus straightened his shoulders, not in defiance but in acceptance. Wilson stood beside him, their shared understanding visible in their stance. The wounded men watched silently as their leaders chose a different path. "Thank you," Marcus said simply, the words carrying the weight of profound change. Then, with deliberate steps, he moved toward the door, Wilson beside him. The evening air carried the promise of something new, something better than the legacy of violence they were leaving behind. As they stepped out into the gathering of law enforcement, James watched through his barbershop window. In the reflection of the last mirror, he caught a glimpse of himself, not the ghost, not just a barber, but something that encompassed both and transcended either. A man who had learned that the strongest choices often look like surrender to those who don't understand the true nature of strength. The ghost of Fallujah remained just that, a ghost, a memory, a reminder of choices made and paths not taken. But in a small-town barbershop where legends came to die and men came to be reborn, something more powerful had taken root. The understanding that every man, no matter his past, carries within him the possibility of transformation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.